No town is without its shadows. On a calm Sunday morning in suburban Nebraska, a father followed the familiar path of his son's paper route. The bike was there, the newspapers were there, but 13-year-old Danny Everly wasn't. But for hours, police searched the neat streets and quiet cul-de-sacs, believing he was just a kid who wandered off. But 3 days later, when searchers found his body in a field, it became clear a predator was hunting children here. And what no one knew then is that this wasn't his first victim or his last. Hey guys, it's the Endless Discovery True Crime, and today we're checking out a serial killer you've probably never even heard of.
Wasn't in the end result, but in the process itself. He was a Boy Scout who grew up to be an Air Force technician, and he also couldn't stop himself from killing. This is the Boy Scout Killer, the crimes of John Joubert. The man behind these killings went by the name John Joseph Joubert IV. Triple J was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts on July 2nd of 1963. His childhood had all the familiar markers of a New England kid growing up Catholic. Church on the weekends, a uniformed walk to parochial school, a working mother trying to keep things steady. But there was an unease about him, even young, a sort of distance in his eyes that separated him from the world around. When John was 4 years old, he had witnessed his father choking his mother until she lost consciousness. Years later, he told therapists that moment had carved itself into his memory, a quiet, permanent wound that never healed. That my family life as a child was in turmoil. There were several loud arguments. My father would come home drunk, he would be abusive towards his mother. By 6, right around the time his parents divorced, Don's mind had turned toward darker places. He started having violent fantasies about killing his babysitter, strangling her, of course, because that seed had been planted. He wanted to watch her die and even wonder what it would be like to cannibalize her afterward. The most disturbing part about all this isn't really the content on the surface, but the fact that these thoughts soothed him. They made him feel calm, though that was only noted by professionals who worked with John after all the bad things he had done. In real time, though, no one really noticed anything too off about JJ, mainly because the adults around him were drowning in their own problems. The divorce was messy, and when it was over, custody became a battleground. John's father wanted him, and his mother refused to allow contact. Eventually, she took John and his younger sister to Portland, Maine. They ended up in a cramped, run-down apartment where tension filled the space as much as the cold did in the winter. John's mother was controlling, rigid, and impossible to please, and Rich Petrie, his future high school band teacher and one of the few adults who tried to mentor him, that she kept the boy on a very tight leash. Nothing he did was ever good enough. And so in that environment, whatever was already broken inside John Joubert only seemed to deepen. The school only made things worse. John was always small for his age and painfully shy.
The kind of kid bullies naturally lock onto, and they did constantly. It was just the nature of the beast. Bigger boys shoved him in the hallways, teased him during recess, and turned his last name into a joke. They called him Jujubee, just like the candy. And John, he just took it, never even tried to fight back. One of his teachers, Francesca Bergen, noticed that, and she said plenty of kids were bullied, but most at least tried to defend themselves, and John didn't. He just absorbed it day after day like he did at home, and she wondered, even then, if maybe he believed he deserved it deep down. You know, a lot of kids have picked on, but they seem to defend themselves, and I think because John did not defend himself, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if he thought he deserved that kind of abuse that he would get. The shoving, you know, the names, the teasing. What no one knew is that John wasn't shaking it off. It all bothered him very much, except he was just internalizing it. All that fear, humiliation, and anger settled somewhere deep inside, turning into something darker by the day. By 11 or 12, his fantasies weren't just violent chaos, they were controlled and more methodical. He imagined tying people up, gagging them, watching them struggle, essentially taking all his struggles and watching them play out in front of him as a form of release. In later psychiatric reports, he admitted the same thing. It wasn't the violence that excited him, it was the fear, the begging, the moment somebody realized they weren't getting away. And yet on the surface, John did everything he could to look normal. He joined the Boy Scouts, played clarinet in the school marching band. At 12, he picked up a paper route, a job he kept for 5 years. He used that money, along with what he made in summer jobs, to help pay tuition at Joubert High School, an all-boys Catholic school in Portland. And academically, he did well too. Honors classes, solid grades. To most people, he was a quiet, bookish kid who just kept to himself. He spent afternoons in his room building model airplanes and listening to music. He didn't date or cause any trouble, at least not yet. Without any real friends, John was left alone with those dark thoughts that swirled in his mind. And in December of 1979, when John was 16, he stopped just fantasizing. A 6-year-old girl named Sarah Canty was playing outside her home in Portland's Oakdale neighborhood when she dropped her football and bent down to pick it up. At that exact moment, a teenager on a green 10-speed bike rode past her and jabbed a pencil hard into her back. It never slowed down, just kept riding. And Sarah ran inside crying, and her parents found a small puncture wound beneath her jacket and called the police. Officers canvassed the area, but there was nothing to go on, no real description of the culprit. I mean, it looked like a strange, senseless one-off. But for John, well, it was a turning point. Because when the girl cried out, he felt something he'd never felt before, a thrill he couldn't shake, and he wanted to feel it again. 6 weeks later, in January of 1980, Vicky Goff was walking to an evening class at the University of Southern Maine. It was cold and the sidewalks mostly empty.
But a young man passed her, and she greeted him politely, just a quick hello. Moments later, someone grabbed her from behind, clamped a hand over her mouth, and drove a knife into her side. At first, she thought she'd been punched until she looked down and saw the blood. The blade had pierced deep. Somehow, Vicky stayed on her feet, turned, and shouted, asking out of instinct, "Why did you do that?" But the young man didn't answer now. He just ran away. She spent a week in the hospital after that, recovering. The trauma lingered so heavily that 4 months later, she and her husband moved out of Portland entirely. Now, police didn't realize it yet, but these attacks were connected. They didn't see the pattern emerging. And if they had, maybe what happened next could have been stopped. Because 2 months later, in March of 1980, 9-year-old Michael Witham was walking along Deering Avenue when a teenager called out to him. Michael approached, and Joubert asked him a few harmless-sounding questions, where he was going, who he lived with, and then, the moment Michael looked away, John slashed his throat with an X-Acto knife. That cut wasn't deep enough to kill him. Michael managed to run home bleeding and survived after receiving 12 stitches. By this point, the entire Oakdale neighborhood was on edge. Parents warned their kids not to walk anywhere alone or talk to strangers. Schools sent out notices, and people kept looking over their shoulders.
It's very scary. I'm, very concerned, so nothing happens, to my children.
Police urged children to travel in groups. Many parents wouldn't let their kids out of their sight. And probably because of that, just as suddenly as they'd begun, the attacks stopped. Whoever the boy on the bike was, he'd vanished. Meanwhile, inside the fractured Joubert household, John quietly finished high school in 1981. He followed the plan he'd talked about for years and enrolled at Norwich University in Vermont to study engineering. But that didn't last long. See, college gave him a kind of freedom he'd never had at home, and he didn't know how to handle it. Alcohol and herb replaced classes and studying. He earned only 10 credits before just calling it a day and dropping out. So by the summer of '82, he was back in Maine, unemployed with no direction to go. So he enlisted in the Air Force, and there he trained as a radar tech. It was structure, at least, something he needed. But before he left Maine, he killed someone for the first time. On the evening of August 22, 1982, 11-year-old Ricky Stenson told his parents he was heading out for a jog around Back Cove, a popular loop in Portland, one he was familiar with. Ricky was a red-haired, freckle-faced kid who loved sports and being outside with friends, just a good, all-American boy who should have gone out that evening for a little exercise, but tragically, he never came home. The following morning, a woman driving across Turkey Keys Bridge spotted a body in the grass below it. It was Ricky. He'd been strangled, stabbed once in the chest, and someone had attempted to remove his clothing. Investigators also found human bite marks on his leg. Police eventually arrested 24-year-old Joseph Anderson for the crime, but the dental impressions didn't match, so after a year and a half, they had to release him.
and with no viable suspects left, well, that case stalled. Meanwhile, John Joubert was long gone, flying high in the Air Force. But by the end of '82, he found himself stationed at Offutt Air Force Base in Bellevue, Nebraska. FBI profiler Robert Ressler, the man who coined the term serial killer, later said he believed Joubert joined the military to get as far away from Maine as possible. And Joubert likely knew that sooner or later someone might connect him to Ricky's murder if he hung around. And so distance meant safety. Bellevue was a quaint little suburban town just south of Omaha. On September 18th of '83, 13-year-old Danny Eberly was pedaling along his paper route, just like the man who would kill him that day had done in his youth. Danny took pride in his job, and especially in the bike he rode every day. By mid-morning, a complaint started rolling in. Well, people hadn't received their Sunday paper. Leonard, Danny's father, got in his car and drove the route himself, searching, and soon found Danny's bike propped neatly against a fence near the fourth house. The remaining newspapers, all 67 of them, were still stacked in the basket. His son was obsessed with that bike, and he knew he'd never leave it out like that, let alone abandon his duty as a paperboy. So it meant only one thing: Danny was gone. What Leonard didn't know was that John Joubert had been setting his alarm for 6:30 a.m. every morning for weeks. He'd wake up, lie there for a moment, and decide whether he was going to go out looking for somebody to hurt. Most mornings, he'd turn off the alarm and drift back to sleep. But on September 18th, he got up and went looking. He spotted Danny at the start of his route. Joubert walked up, pulled a knife, and clamped a hand over the boy's mouth. He told Danny to come with him, and faced with the blade and the hand over his face, Danny had no choice, really, and did exactly what he was told. Joubert led him to his car and drove him to a remote stretch of road just outside of town. 3 days later, searchers found Danny's body in some tall grass along a gravel road about 4 miles from where his bike had been left. Now, he'd been stripped down.
His hands and feet had been bound with an unusual type of rope, and surgical tape covered his mouth. Danny had been stabbed 9 times in total, and some of the wounds were shallow, almost measured, as if the attacker hadn't been in a hurry. According to the medical examiner, Danny was conscious for 3 to 4 agonizing minutes before he passed. Then there was the final detail. Investigators found human bite marks on the boy's body, and this was one of the murders Joubert eventually confessed to in detail. He told investigators that at one point Danny's gag slipped and the boy asked him if he was going to die. Joubert pretty bluntly looked him in the eyes and told him yes. With that, Danny tried to roll away and to get free, but Joubert pinned him by driving the knife into his back. The boy pleaded with him, promised he wouldn't tell anyone, and begged to be taken to the hospital. Joubert later said he paused for a moment and actually thought about it, but then he convinced himself Danny would identify him, so he kept stabbing until the boy stopped moving. "Then I pulled out the knife," he said. "No, please don't kill me. We're done there. He told me that if I would take him to the hospital, he wouldn't say anything. I didn't believe him. In." But all that came much later, of course. At that time, investigators had only the bodies of 2 young boys in different parts of the countries, and one of them had clearly been abducted. Now that detail opened the door for federal involvement. An FBI profiler, Robert Ressler, was then brought in. He studied the scene, the bindings, the tape, the stab patterns, and those bite marks, and from all of it he built a profile of the offender. They were hunting a young white male, single, intelligent but socially isolated, possibly conflicted about his sexuality, and someone who lived or worked near Bellevue, and someone who would absolutely kill again. As it turned out, he was right on every single point. Fast forward to December 2nd, 1983, when 12-year-old Christopher Walden left his house in Pillion, Nebraska, which 3 miles from where they'd found Danny's body, and started walking to school. But he never made it. People in the area said they'd seen a white guy in a tan car that morning. Hunters found Christopher's body 2 days later in some trees about 5 miles outside of town. His throat had been cut so deep he was almost decapitated.
He had been stabbed 7 times. Like Danny, he'd been stripped down too, but unlike Danny, his hands and feet weren't tied. It looked like John had killed him pretty quickly after grabbing them. Now, 5 of those stab wounds didn't go in very deep, so once again, the goal here wasn't in the killing itself. The goal was to inflict pain and watch it. John later confessed that he pulled up next to Christopher while the kid was walking. He showed him the sheath of his knife, like a threat. The boy got into the car because he was scared. Then John drove him out to some railway lines outside of town and told him to take his clothes off, which Christopher did. But when John told him to lie down in the snow, Christopher said no. That's when the fight started. John overpowered him and started strangling him, but his hands got too cold from the weather, so he switched to the knife. Again, investigators really didn't know exactly what had happened in the moment, and by the time this 3rd victim appeared, they had to admit that despite all their efforts, they still didn't have anything solid. That would change, though, on January 11th of 1984, all because John screwed up.
It all began to unravel because of a preschool teacher in Bellevue, as she noticed a man sitting in a car near the school, just watching. Something about him felt wrong, so she walked over and wrote down his license plate number. Before she could finish, he jumped out, shoved her, and threatened to kill her. She managed to break away and call police. When officers traced the plate, they learned the car was a rental, signed out to a 20-year-old Air Force radar technician named John Joubert. When investigators searched Joubert's room on base, they found a length of rope. The moment the FBI saw it, they recognized it. It was the same unusual rope used to bind Danny Everly. This particular type was manufactured in South Korea exclusively for the U.S. military, not something an average civilian would ever come across. Under questioning, Joubert admitted he'd gotten the rope from an ex-military scoutmaster he worked with back in the day, and he kept it and used it. Investigators also found a hunting knife in his car as well. And Joubert was calm the entire time, and too calm, actually, almost relieved. He confessed to both Nebraska murders without hesitation. When they asked whether he would kill again if he walked out of that room, he said yes. He even told them he was glad he'd been caught because he didn't think he could stop himself. John J. Joubert, 20, an airman from Moffett Air Force Base, was arrested tonight by the task force. Once he was in custody, the FBI began comparing his crimes to others around the country. Robert Ressler and a team from Maine immediately noticed similarities to the unsolved killing of Ricky Stutson back in Portland. They took Joubert's dental impressions and hair samples. That bite mark on Ricky's leg was a perfect match. By January of '86, Joubert was indicted for Ricky's murder, and once investigators dug deeper, they tied him to the earliest attacks in Portland. Sarah Canty, Michael Whitman, Vicky Goff, and multiple other attempted assaults. The pattern was unmistakable. In Nebraska, Joubert was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He initially pleaded not guilty and then changed his plea to guilty. A panel of psychiatrists evaluated him and diagnosed obsessive-compulsive disorder, sadistic tendencies, and schizoid personality disorder. But every expert agreed he was fully aware of his actions when he killed those boys. A 3-judge panel sentenced him to death for the Nebraska murders. In Maine, where the death penalty doesn't exist, he received life in prison for Ricky Stutson's murder. He spent more than a decade on death row at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, and Joubert filled those years reading Freud and Hemingway, lifting weights, and teaching himself to draw. And those drawings, well, most of them weren't seascapes. They were pretty disturbing, violent scenes that involved young boys. Years later, journalist Mark Pettit obtained copies and showed them to criminal profilers, and every one of them said the same thing. Joubert's fantasies hadn't faded with time, and they'd sharpened, deepened. If he ever walked out of that prison, they said it's almost certain he would kill again. Still, before his execution, Joubert insisted he'd changed. He said he finally asked his mother and sister whether anything traumatic had happened to him as a child. That's when his mother admitted, only then, that his father once choked her unconscious in front of him. And Joubert claimed that moment had shaped everything.
and that now that he understood it, he would never kill again. Almost no one believed him, though. I believe that I would never kill anyone again.
Yes, I know that I could never harm a hand. And so, on July 17th, 1996, at 12:01 a.m., J.J. was led into the execution chamber in Nebraska. He was 33 years old. At 12:29 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Years before that, he told a reporter from the Omaha World-Herald that what thrilled him most wasn't the violence itself, it was the power and control, the look in a child's eyes when they realized they weren't going to get away. That's what he lived for. In the end, the only reason he didn't keep going was because a preschool teacher, doing something as simple as writing down a license plate number, refused to ignore the feeling in her gut that something wasn't right with this guy. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Not a badge, not a profiler, not a task force, just one person who pays attention. And sometimes, that's the difference between another victim and the moment a killer's world finally comes undone. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Endless Discovery True Crime. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please do subscribe because that's the easiest way that really helps us out. Appreciate you very much. Thanks for tuning in. It means a lot. Remember to come back next week for another episode filled with scary, strange, and mysterious stories because you never know, maybe your town will be next.